I offer these every week along with a guided meditation. Just click the subscribe link below to be notified through YouTube when I post the latest recording. Or if you'd like to join us live, which would be great, just go into the description section below and follow the link along to be able to sign up for free. So I would like to explore with you a fundamental matter of what increases our suffering and what decreases, and even on the whole, can even eliminate it. We don't want to suffer. We don't want to make other people suffer. And by suffer, I include very subtle experiences of frustration, stress, irritation, contraction, and more extreme experiences of physical or psychological anguish, the full range. The Buddha made a distinction between the inevitable, inescapable, and arguably sometimes morally appropriate discomforts. And in that word, I'm including extreme agony, if that's what is happening. The Buddha made a distinction between inevitable and avoidable pain of various kinds. He distinguished between that and the add-ons to that inescapable and perhaps appropriate pain that we create ourselves. He used the metaphor of the first dart and the second dart. The first dart for inescapable and potentially appropriate pain, and the add-ons that he and we could call suffering. It's completely understandable if sometimes we feel grief-stricken or terrified or enraged. I remember walking around in Haiti some years ago, and the best way I could describe my state of mind was cold rage. I was functional, I was effective, and I was in a cold rage. I was profoundly outraged by what I could see very directly there that I'd really only known about abstractly before. And so someone might say that it's appropriate to be disturbed, revved up, enraged by one condition or another. I recall going into a junior high school environment where our daughter was going to school, and we'd had it up to here with how a math teacher was treating her and some of the other girls, not a coincidence, in the classroom. And there's a place for that. That anger fueled me. Anger has a function. It highlights outrages of various kinds. It highlights misbehavior. It energizes us, and it kind of pulls together what can sometimes feel like a fragmented being. Okay. And you decide for yourself whether being disturbed is working for you. And you decide for yourself how long it's appropriate to rest in helpless outrage. Decide for yourself in certain conditions with other people in your immediate life, perhaps, how long is it appropriate to feel aggrieved and resentful? Maybe it's working for you to be that way. How much does it help you to be anxious about things that you can't affect? You decide. Everyone gets to decide for themselves. What's the distinction between, for you, between pain and suffering, between that first dart and the second dart? You decide. And what the Buddha was interested in was not lecturing people about which is which. The Buddha was interested in responding to people who came to him essentially asking, okay, life is what it is. It includes, imagine life in northern India 2,500 years ago. Life includes a lot of physical pain. Life includes loss. Life includes circumstances, upheaval, tyranny, slavery sometimes, um, killings, battles, brutality. Life includes all these things. How can we suffer less? So I'd like to explore with you some insights from modern brain science about this fundamental question. What causes the add-on of suffering? And how do the residues of those add-on sufferings lodge in our bodies? How do they affect us and our relationships with others? And what can we do both to prevent those residues from lodging within us? And what can we do to potentially even wash ourselves cleaner, if not entirely clean, of the residues we've accumulated so far? How can we do that? So, first question, what's the driver in this body biologically of suffering, in the sense I'm using that word here? And the Buddha asserted that the fundamental driver of that suffering is what he called craving. In Pali, tanha, the second noble truth, whose root meaning is thirst. Something is missing, something is wrong, initiating what psychologists and others would call a drive state. So, drawing on Robert Sapolsky's masterpiece, Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers, the title tells at least half the tale, the normal biological blueprint, including for our human ancestors, is to spend most of their time not suffering, because suffering wears down the body-mind and lowers the odds of survival and the capacity to pass on genes that pass on genes. So Mother Nature's blueprint has, by design, very little suffering in it. Imagine zebras out on a field, the Serengeti plains, nibbling on the grass, rubbing up against each other, keeping a watchful eye for the lions, but not being upset in the moment. Notice that we can be strong. We can deal with threats. We can be vigilant and prepared to deal with them without being invaded and occupied by various kinds of anxiety or anger. It's an important distinction here. So now we have the zebras. We are all zebras here, 506 of us, right? And then suddenly, boom, the lions attack. Wing! A big spike. Stress response, I call it red zone stress. So, wing! Brief episode of stress that in the wild, usually, as Sapolsky put it, ends quickly, one way or another. All right? Whatever the outcome is for the zebras or the lions, whoosh, very quickly, most, if not all, of the zebras in the herd go back to their baseline. Low stress, minimal craving, minimal suffering. That's Mother Nature's blueprint. Unfortunately, humans today are continually flooded by threat and opportunity messages. Threats, now we crave the relief from the threat, and we crave escape, and we want the pain to go away, or we don't want the bad thing to happen, or we're flooded with some shiny object. Oh, chase this, knew that, go get it, strive. And in either response, in either reaction, when there's craving present, there are qualities of contraction, pressure, and typically one or more of the emotions of, broadly, sadness, fear, anger, or hurt or shame. You know what it feels like. We all know what it feels like. In gross forms of drivenness, intensity, alarm, contraction, collapse, freezing, the sense of fighting or fleeing or having to appease, or some people put it, tracking the F's here, fawn over some powerful figure. Oh, don't hurt me, don't hurt me. We know what these things feel like, don't we? We know what it's like to get caught up in preoccupations, to be looping and ruminating about our case against others with associated feelings of resentment and grievance. We know what it's like to feel invaded by just an overwhelming, disempowering sense of alarm, immobilizing sense of alarm. We know what that's like. We even know what it's like in subtler forms, and this has been a lot of interest to me personally, which is we know what it's like to get caught up in goal-directed pursuit, ticking one task after another off of our list, trying to meet or attain some standard after another, driving toward the result with typically qualities of a certain amount of pressure, a certain amount of contraction, and typically a fair amount of selfing along the way. We know what that's like. We can see directly that doing that in the moment, doesn't feel that good, and leaves residues behind. In neuropsychology, those residues have a fancy term. You can look it up. I'm blanking on the person who coined the term. It'll come to me maybe later. Allostatic load, spelled A-L-L static, allostatic load. Essentially, wear and tear accumulating in the body. The zebras, yes, they feel stressed. Cortisol is rushing through their bloodstream. Their various activations of the sympathetic branch of the nervous system are in gear. The pupils start to dilate. Blood flows to the extremities for action. All that's going on with a rapid recovery. Right? They come back. There's very little wear and tear. There's a momentary burst. Zebras and humans are designed for these brief bursts of stress response and then return. Very little wear and tear. But with us, while we may not be in the bright red of the red zone, we live in the pink zone, most of us all day long, including those of us like me who are pretty happy maybe while having a long checklist each day of this or that to accomplish, whether it's in an occupational frame or lately for us, clearing out the endless pile in our garage. One task after another, boom, accomplishing that. That all leaves residues behind in the body. Maybe those residues are fairly mild to moderate. They're not going to, make you die prematurely, perhaps. But on the other hand, they gradually shadow your consciousness. These residues wear down our mood, and they sensitize us. They prime us for future red zone stress. When you're rushing about, you've got to put away the groceries maybe before other people come, or you've got to teach some meditation or whatever it might be. You're rushing about. As soon as we start rushing about, as soon as we start accelerating, particularly if negative emotions are involved, negative, not bad, but emotions like in the range, sadness, anger, fear, and hurt or shame. Soon as that gets involved in the mix, stress hormones like cortisol get released, which move into your brain. And in your brain, cortisol releases, even associated with very, fairly mild feelings of exasperation or frustration or worry or grievance. Even mild releases of cortisol go into your brain and have a 1-2 punch there in which they both sensitize the amygdala, which functions as a kind of alarm bell in the brain, and weaken a nearby region, the hippocampus, which regulates the hippocampus, calming it down, while also the hippocampus is sending signals to the hypothalamus that enough cortisol already, dial it all back. What that creates is a vicious cycle. in which experiences of even mild stress and today sensitize your brain so that now the amygdala is a little more reactive and the hippocampus is a little weaker in terms of regulating it and calming it down, which makes us even more vulnerable to spikes of suffering, spikes of craving, spikes of stressing tomorrow. I think of allostatic load as grit, even very fine grit, gradually drifting down each day, episode after episode after episode, each day, drifting down like grit into the machinery, the workings, the clockwork machinery, of our own body mind, gradually sifting down, lowering our mood, priming us for reactivity, deepening our doubts about our own worth and goodness and what the world, can be. What do we do? What do we do to reduce the accumulation in the beginning, going forward? What can we do to prevent craving? What can we do to prevent the accumulation of allostatic load? And what can we do to clear out our history? The Buddha had a lot to say about preventing craving in the first place. He laid out the Noble Eightfold Path. He described 3 fundamental pillars or foundations of practice: moral virtue, mental training, and wisdom. He had various factors of awakening like tranquility and effort, mindfulness, even bliss, concentration and equanimity. We have the beautiful Brahma Viharas of compassion, kindness, happiness at the welfare of others, and equanimity again. We have all that. That's really, really good stuff. Really, really good stuff. In early Buddhism, there's an emphasis on insight, in the recognition early in the front end of the processing stream of things being pleasant or unpleasant before craving, the machinery of craving, reacts to what's unpleasant or pursues what's pleasant. Developing insight into that sequence early on, real-time mindfulness at a very granular level. Great stuff. Great stuff. All right. So he certainly said all that. And to reiterate, really, his primary teaching focus was enabling people to suffer less and move more and more in the direction of enlightenment. And in all that, I have seen many examples in history and in the world today of people who were very deep in their practice, like Thich Nhat Hanh, for example, Dr. Martin Luther King, Nelson Mandela, others, Mempela Rampelli, the chair, until very recently, the chair of our board for the Global Compassion Coalition and a major anti-apartheid activist. Many other examples. I think of Michelle Obama in America these days. People who clearly have a deep personal practice and have found, I believe, and developed a core of being that is fundamentally unshakable and at peace and not invaded and tainted by hatred, who also are forces of nature, who also are very powerful, morally clear. The Dalai Lama, another example, very powerful, very clear, and very effective within their limitations of their times in speaking truth to power and producing social change. And at the local individual level, of families and businesses and neighborhoods and schools. We can think probably as well of many, many examples of people who have a fundamental stability inside of calm strength and a fundamental kindness in their nature, who also are very formidable and very effective and influential. And in fact, one factor that really enables them to be quite effective and influential is they don't sputter in helpless outrage. They are not overwhelmed by their anger. They use their anger rather than letting their anger use them. There are many, many examples of this sort. So I'd like to talk now about several ways to prevent craving in the first place and the accumulation of allostatic load in the first place. And then I want to explore with you one way in particular that I've been really getting a lot out of these days about a kind of retroactive clearing of what's lodged in us from the past. So in terms of preventing, appreciating all the many lists that the Buddha has and all the other good stuff out there in the whole world, great. I want to draw your attention to the three things we explored in the meditation, which I don't generally see on many lists. They might be fresh for you. They're fresh for me experientially, and they have a quality of being kind of bottom up, right? So by the way, I see, Mary, your comment, allostatic load. You can check it out. I bet there's a Wikipedia entry. Think of it as wear and tear. The gradual wear and tear on the body of frequent releases of adrenaline and cortisol, of the heart racing, of tension in the body. Think of it like that. And then we could kind of broaden that notion into the mind, repeated experiences in which we're frustrated or driven or we feel attacked or we're resentful. There's a load, the residues. That's kind of what I'm meaning by it, okay? Including the residues of pressured, goal-directed action, even if it's successful. Because much of the time, when you're pursuing a goal, whether it's a modest one like loading the dishwasher or a big one like, getting a quarterly report in, until you attain the goal, there's typically a sense of falling short. Not there yet, not yet achieving the standard, kind of a contracted sense of drivenness and pressure, even if, you're not unhappy or angry, even if you're enthusiastic, there's that sense of pressure and drivenness that's not yet been fulfilled. And then when the goal is achieved, typically there's just a few seconds for most people, if that, of a sense of arriving and whoof, done, and then maybe it's the next morning, you start all over again. So the duration of time in pursuit is typically, for most of us, certainly for me, much, 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 much greater than the duration of experiences of relief, attainment, arriving, accomplishment, self-worth. That disproportionality is worth paying attention to and considering it's the residues it leaves behind. So in terms of prevention, one that as a somewhat anxious person I've come to deeply appreciate is to recognize when you are basically all right now, when it's true. There have been some times in my life, I nearly drowned once. There have been other episodes. Sometimes I've been attacked by people. I wasn't all right. And sometimes we hear shocking news, terrible news. No, I'm not basically all right. If you're not basically all right, you're not basically all right. But if you are in the present, why not let it sink in? Why not let that deep sense of safety in the present sink in? And when we do that, we're just not primed for fighting and fleeing. We don't receive the next moment with our guard up or already feeling overwhelmed. We rest instead in a sense of calm, centered strength, that can be vigilant, that can be clear-seeing, but in the present has qualities which feel really good and are healing for the body-mind and which prevent craving, we feel at ease. We feel at peace. It's a beautiful exploration. It's really worth letting yourself explore it. And for those of us who get anxious about not feeling anxious, because that's when you lower your guard and they whack you, right? It's especially important to realize that you can feel basically all right in the present, centered in calm strength, aware of potential threats and making your own plans. You can do all that while feeling basically no sense of anxiety. It's useful to appreciate how much anxiety is delusional anxiety. It's a trickle released by well-intended Mother Nature to keep her little babies on their toes. I had a really interesting experience once in Joshua Tree National Park 30 or so years ago, maybe a little more, in which I was hiking deep into wilderness all by myself. I knew what I was doing. I knew where I was going. I was okay. And I kept watching this trickle of anxiety arising for no reason at all. Just, then I'd be aware of it. I'd let it go. It would come up again. So much. Sometimes we're not as anxious as we should be about certain things, particularly big picture and long-term things like global warming and the erosion, let's say, of democratic norms, the rule of law. Yeah, maybe more people ought to be more anxious about that. Okay. And much of the time, we're more anxious than we really need to be in the present. And so if you don't need to be anxious in the present, why not let it go and help yourself feel as safe as you reasonably can? So that's the first suggestion. And because the most primal need of all is for safety, when you help yourself feel as safe as you reasonably can in the present, that has global effects. It really dials down the machinery of craving broadly. Wow. Including helping yourself feel, when it's appropriate, safe enough in the present with another person. Because very often it's other people that we're anxious around or we feel threatened by. Well, if there's something to deal with it as best you can. But otherwise, if you're doing okay with that person, they're okay with you, can you help residues of anxiety to be released? Very, very powerful. Second, the practice that we did in the meditation of going wide, opening. You can observe that the structure of craving involves a fixation on one part of reality, a part that's problematic, or a goal, a carrot we're chasing, or a stick we're fleeing. There's a fixation on some part of the whole. That's the structure of suffering, craving and suffering. On the other hand, when we open out and see the big picture, we're not so hijacked by attention to the one red light on the mosaic of reality with many, many tiles that's flashing, the one red light that's flashing, that's capturing attention. We're seeing more of the whole. We may recognize that red light, we see it, but we're not so consumed by it. We're not so invaded by it. The Buddha talked about in his run-up to enlightenment that painful, racking feelings arose, but they did not invade my mind and remain. That's the difference. Feelings arise, they come, they go, but they need not invade the mind and remain with their allostatic load of residues. Okay, so when we go wide, we're less invaded by the red light flashing, and also neurologically some good things happen. Technically, when we go wide, we tend to engage, for right-handed people, certainly, the right hemisphere of the brain, which does visual spatial processing, and it exerts what's called reciprocal inhibition on the verbal processing centers for most people in the left hemisphere. So there's less inner chatter. There's less, yammering of criticizing and ruminating. just by going wide, you'll notice that your mind gets quieter. Getting a sense of the room as a whole, the situation as a whole, your body as a whole, you know, Earth as a whole, the cosmos as a whole. Anytime you go wide, lifting your gaze to the horizon, watch what happens. The inclination toward craving and thus suffering diminishes when we go wide. It's kind of remarkable. The bird's eye view, big picture, going wide, really powerful. Spaciousness, yeah. And then third, along with helping yourself rest in calm strength and not taking on board needless anxiety, and you decide how much anxiety is useful and how much is not, remembering that we can be very clear-eyed about threats, including threats to our country or to our own body, without getting caught up in fear about it. That itself is kind of a remarkable, liberating realization for many people. Okay, so letting go of anxiety, resting and kind of opening wide. What's often arises then is a fullness of love. A fullness of love. We start to feel like, wow, there's even almost mysteriously a kind of universal current of lovingness moving through us. And if you don't relate to that idea of a kind of universal current of lovingness, just there's a sense of your own good heart, your own innate goodness. It might be covered over by this or that. You might need to help yourself get a little quieter inside to get in touch with it. But you can start to realize, wow, you're a fundamentally decent person. You start to get a sense, okay, of what is it like to give over to love broadly, to give over to compassion, to widening your circle of compassion. You're widening the circle of moral concern, it's sometimes called. What's that like? Oh. And interestingly, when we, in the moment, have a sense of receiving lovingness or giving lovingness, the stress chemistry in the body usually calms down. And also, we feel less driven because in the present, we're already being fulfilled in a very, very important kind of way. Love flowing in and flowing out is a kind of universal medicine for what ails us. It's useful, of course, to be aware of other wholesome, beneficial factors, but love is valued by all the great teachers for all kinds of good reasons. So you might explore for yourself, what is it like to give over to or be lived by love moving through you, rather than having to remind yourself to be nice to people or to make yourself be good to them. I have found for myself that actually almost everyone can access a sense of love living through them, being lived by love, carried along, fed by love, especially if we feel that others are not treating us well, because they're not, especially if we feel that we've been let down by others who are not giving us, we're not receiving enough, because we're not. When that's true, it's true. It can seem, I don't want to, like I'm tired. They should love me. Why do I have to love anyone? Love broadly. Why do I have to, include others? Why do I have to have empathy for them? Why do I have to appreciate them? Well, you don't have to. You decide. You decide what's in your best interest. But if you explore this, I think what people find routinely is that as we feel kindness and caringness for others, as we get in touch with, wishing others well, Maybe not everybody is on your list. That's up to you to decide. But you can observe directly that caringness feeds us as it flows through us. And it's under our own power. We don't have that much power to get other people to care about us, to like us, to include us, to appreciate us, But on the other hand, we can ourselves choose to wish them well. We may disagree with them. We may want justice to be served upon them while not having hatred or enmity poison our heart. So consider those three in your own practice, along with whatever other practices you're doing, just very experientially, right? Helping yourself release unnecessary anxiety in the present while widening and opening and inviting and welcoming whatever is true for you, a fundamental warm-heartedness moving through you. It's a wonderful way to move through the day. Probably, if you're like me, forgetting it often enough, but then coming back to it and increasingly letting it be a kind of new habit, a new trait, a new way of being that is increasingly established in you. With these three qualities that you can recognize experientially. And now I want to talk about the past and something really remarkable that I just have stumbled on. And I invite you to see what's true for you when you play around with this, right? As you experiment with it. How do we clear out allostatic residues from the past? Now, certainly, what I'm about to say could relate to feelings of guilt or remorse. And I'm not saying anything here that is to cover over or bypass a moral clarity, including about yourself. And if you've read anything I've written about dealing with mistakes, regrets, and remorse, or heard me talk about it, or seen the passages in the book Resilient about forgiveness, including of oneself, for me, the process very much includes feeling what is appropriate to feel and really recognizing and taking responsibility for what is your part, while also being clear about what is not your part, and clear about the very large big picture, which is a kind of widening and opening, isn't it? That's also in the mix. That said, what I'm about to talk about can be applied to feelings of regret and remorse. Interestingly, I have found it can also be applied somehow to that grit that sifts down into us, that allostatic load from, at least in my own case, having lived a lot on the basis of goal-directed pursuit, accomplishing one thing after another, one task after another, fulfilling one duty after another, progressing step by step by step by step after another along the way. Okay, here it is. I have found, and you could try it, that if you kind of center yourself, and the words might be different for different people, you sort of center yourself and you consider yourself as a being. All the many forces shaping you and pushing you this way and that, and squeezing you down and lifting you up and twirling you around, and all the rest of it in your life. That being, you. Conception onward. So much. See what happens when you look back at that you and you say to them, or you feel it, you really did the best you could. You had a good heart. You tried. You learned. Bless you. Can you give yourself your blessing while knowing that now you have principles, you have integrity, you have values, you have a work ethic. You're going to keep trying, you're going to keep learning, you're going to keep bringing your heart to it. And for the past, maybe with a rueful shake of your head, if you're me, you did the best you could. You tried, you brought your heart to it, you learned along the way. Really, bless you. Let it go. Let it go. It can have a quality, even, this is a uncommon word, of absolution. Absolution. Find your own words, here, but it's a kind of absolution. Like, all that dissolving in your past. I mean, what would it be like to wash it clean? People do traditional rituals, baptisms, for example, in which they wash clean. Can you help yourself feel washed clean as best you can? And exploring this again and again as a kind of experiment for the wear and tear, washed clean of the wear and tear you've accumulated over the years, including the moral wear and tear, all those old feelings of falling short as you chased one task or step or goal after another. Bye-bye. Let it go. Not as a cheap fix, not as a bypass, not as some kind of new age hack, but as something really kind of sacred. Blessing, benediction, absolution for yourself, for those residues. Letting it go. And knowing also that as you wash clean, clear out, release, not suppress, not shove away, more like bless away. As you do that, there are fewer factors creating more craving in the present. A fair amount of what creates craving in the present are the residues of past episodes of craving. So as we give a release, including physically, setting them down, exhaling, releasing, a blanket pardon for yourself. Needing to learn lessons learned are still present, even with a blanket pardon. Can you give yourself that kind of absolution? And to finish here, it's up to each of us most of the time where we put our attention. You decide where you want to rest it. Sometimes our attention is compelled. We're very shocked. It's understandable. We're disturbed, let's say. Very understandable. But much of the rest of the time, attention is under your control. It might get taken back to some shiny object, but then you can exercise control and return it to what's helpful for you. So you decide, is it helpful to put attention on the processes in your own being that create residues of suffering, that create grit and sand in the inner machinery of your being? Is it helpful for you to be aware of that? Is it helpful for you to be aware in particular of releasing unnecessary fear, widening awareness, and opening to your own good heart? is it useful for you to rest your attention there? Is it useful for you to allocate attention to what is outrageous and what you're concerned about to the extent that is productive for you and for others? And then, is it useful for you to say, enough? I know enough about what's happening. I'm clear enough about what I believe and what I value and what I'm going to do. And now I'm going to put my attention elsewhere. That is more productive for me. It's more useful and healing and wise for me and for other people, out of kindness for myself and probably also some kindness for others. That's up to you. That's up to each person to decide what's appropriate. But do not forget that you are in control of your attention, except in those fairly rare times when we're completely compelled and overwhelmed. Okay. So I hope this has been useful for you. I really wish you well. Clearly, these are very challenging times. It's extremely disturbing. I am disturbed by the deliberate chaos and cruelty in the current administration in America and the terrible consequences for others, including the prevention of good things in the years and decades to come. Extremely disturbing. I'd have no blind eye to any of that. And if you've read anything I've written or listened to anything I've said, you know where I stand about all that. And meanwhile, how shall we live? How shall we live? And what can protect us and fuel us for the long fight? That's always been the case and will be the case in the years to come. See for yourself what is useful here. As the Buddha said a long time ago, don't take anything on faith alone. Don't take anything because I said it. Don't take anything out of, blind belief in me or trust. See for yourself, he said again and again, what has the ring of truth over time. And again, you find personally helpful. That's the fundamental standard. So thank you for your kind attention. Thank you for your practice. Thank you for practicing together with benefits for all of us here and rippling out into the whole world.